Hi, I'm Joe Ford, Senior Analyst at Oxford Analytica. I'm joined by my colleague Herve Lemahieu. Welcome to our weekly video where we reflect on some of the issues that we've been following in our daily brief analysis coverage. This week's theme is elections. A key aspect of macro diligence for public and private sector clients is anticipating, tracking, responding to the issues that are raised, both around particular elections and their results and their outcomes, but also the thematic issues that the changing political values, ideologies and orientations that we can discern across electoral systems and across countries and regions. In the region I cover, Africa, we've seen election results in the last week in Mali and Zimbabwe. Very different settings, but one thing they have in common is a great deal of Western interest or perceived Western interest, Western influence or perceived Western influence in those outcomes. And what that raises really are a whole range of issues, both for investors and for policymakers, around really the limits of that influence, the trade-offs that are necessary between stability and democracy, whether we're seeing a pattern, for example, where the international community, regional states, are happy with just a good enough election rather than one that meets all sorts of international standards, and what that means. And the dilemmas, particularly for Western states, which are more proactive on democracy and election issues, dilemmas involving engagement or non-engagement, isolation, and the pushing of certain standards. Herve, an election which didn't gain perhaps as much attention as Mali or Zimbabwe was the recent election in Cambodia, a country you follow. Do any of these themes about the dilemmas of engagement, non-engagement, the trade-offs that Western and other outside powers must face, did they arise in that election? And of course there's also the strategic competition context in that part of the world between the West and particularly China.
Very much so. I mean, I think Cambodia comes out of a process, sort of a very difficult history and political background, but one in which on paper you saw the recovery of a post-conflict state into something which resembled stability with the donor involvement, Western donor involvement, a UN peacekeeping arrangement which took place from 1992 to 1993, the restoration of electoral democracy, at least on paper, in 5-yearly cycles. But in that period of time, since 1992, we have seen the consolidation of power by the ruling party and by one man in particular, Prime Minister Hun Sen, who now becomes Asia's longest serving head of government. And of course he's been very adept at being able to balance Western donors on the one hand and Western relations with a growing China. And we saw that particularly in negotiations which took place last year on ASEAN and whether or not to include in ASEAN's discussions a South China Sea Code of Conduct, which Cambodia was against. But so very much we come from a position in Cambodia of disillusionment in Western circles at the fact that the post-conflict nation building didn't quite play out the way that it had been anticipated to do so.
Despite a great deal of attention and
despite a great deal of attention, half the national budget being supported by Western donors. Although what we saw in this most recent election was actually a galvanized opposition. For the first time in 15 years, we saw an opposition take roughly 45% of the parliamentary representation. So we still see a ruling party in power, but one whose power is perhaps slightly more compromised. So we're entering into a volatile period of political standoff, possibly prolonged.
Talking of volatile, another country you cover, of course, is Myanmar, Burma, and faces elections in 2015, the first elections really since the emergence from isolation, at least isolation in relation to the West. Do you see some of these themes, again, for policymakers in the West, for investors, in terms of the terms on which they engage or the timing in which they engage in the framework for viewing that? Are some of these legitimacy issues, some of these trade-offs likely to arise there, or they're already arising?
They're very much present and on the ground. And what makes Myanmar or Burma so interesting is that it comes from almost the opposite chronological order to what's taken place in Cambodia. So we come from a position of non-engagement, of sanctions policy by Western players in particular, against a military-run regime. We then saw in 2011 a state-run, sort of state-managed top-down transition to something which appeared slightly more resembling, or resembled slightly more what we would conceive of a democracy in the West. And as a result of that, a huge influx now in engagement, in international goodwill, in seeking to positively influence the transition in the lead up to the 2015 general elections. The question becomes whether the ruling party will be willing to concede a possible, in fact, a highly likely electoral defeat in 2015 under a free and fair election. Or whether, so in other words, something more like Indonesia and post-Suharto Indonesia, where the Golkar party was able to relinquish its position of preeminence with a minimal fuss, or a position like in Cambodia, where we see the ruling party essentially consolidate its rule.
And the dilemmas that it raises then for the Western and other partners that have been involved in that transition.
I think one thing is clear, and that is that it's never as manageable as we seem to think it is viewed from outside the country.
Thanks very much, Herve. A lesson or some ideas about humility in terms of diplomacy and outreach. Elections are an issue we obviously follow closely in the Daily Brief, and we'll continue through our weekly videos to touch on some of those issues. A key aspect of macro diligence, the electoral cycle, the so what question about elections in terms of sometimes the limited significance they have for policy making, for investment policy, and for other issues. Thanks for joining us, and see you next time.